Hello everyone and welcome to the Music Professor channel. My name's Matthew King. I'm not being assisted today by Loki, my normally faithful assistant, and the reason for that, he's not died because a lot of you keep asking whether he's okay. He always is okay, but today he's gone for a walk, so he's out. He's bounding around somewhere outside, having fun, much more fun than he would be having in here. So the other thing to say is that today we're trying to respond to all the many suggestions we've had from kind contributors over the past year, suggesting that we ought to be upgrading our equipment. And we're trying to do that. And just at the moment, we're trying some things out. The audio is sort of as it was at the moment, but we are about to get some new gear. So hopefully things are improving with the audio and with the look of the video. So thank you for all your suggestions. So today's video is going to focus on a couple of musical events. One is the 80th birthday of Joni Mitchell last week, which I thought was not covered in much detail in the news, but I think Joni Mitchell is one of the most important songwriters of one of the most important living songwriters, and wonderful things like her album Blue, for example, solo album from the early 70s, sort of defined what a solo artist could do. Really one of the finest solo albums ever made. And also extraordinary songs through her career. I'm not going to attempt to play any of them today. Maybe if I get enough requests, we might feature Joni, because I've always thought she's marvellous. One of my favourite songs is a song called Emilia, which I actually would like to do a video about one day. That's on an album called Hejira. And Emilia, it's a fascinating song and one to listen to if you don't know it. Okay, so the main focus today is the other topic in the news, which is the release of, extraordinarily, because my goodness, who would imagine that it could happen? But the release of a Beatles song a couple of weeks ago called Now and Then. And it's quite funny because from a certain point of view, I am well aware that this channel is characteristically granddadish on reporting on this rather late. I think there are probably about 755 reaction videos already out there on YouTube, and all sorts of eminent people commenting and not so eminent people, but lots of interesting comment. The reason why I wanted to focus on it today, apart from the fact that some of my own students seemed unaware of the event, so it's curious that quite a lot of young people aren't aware of it. But the Beatles a couple of weeks ago released a song called Now and Then, which was originally recorded by John Lennon in 1977, just playing an upright piano in his apartment, as far as I know, and recorded on a tape recorder. So the recording was quite primitive, and you hear John singing it with the piano.
I know it's true.
So, given that we're so behind the curve on this video, I think what I really want to do is not go into all the details of the song like other people have done. What would be the point in that? But much more to perhaps frame it as a cultural event, very briefly, and then do something else, which we'll get onto in a minute. I'm sort of toying with the idea of responding to various people's requests that I improvise things in the style of classical composers, which is quite funny. And I'm happy to try it with this song because it might be entertaining. So we'll get onto that in a minute. But first of all, the song itself, well, in its original form, the demo that John Lennon recorded in 1977, it's an extraordinarily melancholic song. It's got this plodding A minor. It's really quite slow. It's slower than on the release version. And it's got this sort of almost funereal tread and a lamenting style. The harmonic pull is always in a downward direction. Particularly at one point the Beatles recording actually edits out, which is the bit where it goes weirdly to F sharp minor, the sharp and submediant, and John sings I don't want to lose you, which that's my only brief moment where I'm going to try to sing like John Lennon. F sharp minor, so that doesn't happen in the Beatles release, and in some ways it's a bit sad to lose that moment because it's rather a beautiful and very surprising harmonic shift in a piece of popular music, a pop song, really unusual. But, I completely understand why they don't have it, and that part of the song in the original demo slightly loses energy, if I can put it that way. Have a listen to the demo and see what you think, because I'd be interested in your comments. What the final release has done is it's almost miraculous. First thing to say is that they've sped it up, so it's not quite so lugubrious, it doesn't sound quite so lamenting. I think originally in the mid-90s, when they had a go as a band, the three Beatles, they had a go with this track, but they couldn't really make it work because the recording wasn't good enough and they didn't know how to extract John's vocals from the sort of mush of audio on the original demo. George Harrison, though, did play along with it, so you can hear George Harrison very quietly playing acoustic guitar. But the main issue was that none of the Beatles were convinced that it was really releasable at that point, and George Harrison apparently didn't even like the song very much. So anyway, many years later, in other words, very recently, the technology caught up with what they needed to do, which was extract John's vocals from the piano track altogether, so you just have John's voice. And then they could produce it, have Paul McCartney playing the piano, and Ringo could play drums, and they could edit in a bit of George Harrison playing his guitar. But for the main guitar solo, Paul McCartney plays it, and it's rather touching because he plays a slide guitar solo, clearly a homage to George Harrison, who's no longer with us. And of course the whole song is a homage in a sense to Lennon, whose original song it was. And so you have this, culturally speaking, rather loaded document that we've all got to process. A band that back in the 1960s was astonishingly fertile, creative, richly inventive like no other pop music ever, probably. I mean, again, that's controversial, but I think the Beatles are an extraordinary phenomenon. Extraordinary in the 1960s too, because they were all of them lads from the north of England, essentially working class lads without any formal musical education. And yet working together with George Martin, their producer, who had been to Guildhall School of Music and Drama, where I teach, as a little plug for Guildhall. But the combination of his sophisticated understanding of orchestration and to some extent of studio techniques, and the rather brilliant people who were employed by EMI, but more importantly, the sheer raw talent of the four Beatles themselves. Paul McCartney and John Lennon were, of course, songwriters of genius, and George Harrison also emerged later on as a marvellous songwriter too. So you have all these creative, wonderful creative people working together, and the rivalry between them sort of energised that creativity. So it really was sort of incendiary. There's a sense that the whole thing catches fire in the mid-60s, and it just becomes fantastic. Album after album, Rubber Soul, Revolver, Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, The White Album, Abbey Road at the end, and of course Let It Be, which is the sort of, you might almost describe as an unfinished album that is in a sense incomplete, but is full of marvellous songs. So no other band has ever released that kind of incredible visionary sequence of recordings. What's it an equivalent to? I don't know. Alfred Hitchcock's films in the late 50s maybe, but it's an amazing achievement. And it's almost like a classical composer. It reminds me of, certain periods in the work of, Beethoven or something between 1803 and 1810, when he's just churning out masterpiece after masterpiece. But these things matter. These moments of creative energy that seem absolutely to typify the era in which they were written. That's the other thing. The Beatles exemplify the 1960s. They really do, in some marvellous, all-encompassing sense. Now, the issue really is that, first of all, in the 1970s, none of the individual solo Beatles careers, in any sense, typified the 1970s, or do you see what I mean? Whereas in the 1960s they were central, apart, split into four, they are no longer those things, even though they are, of course, talented people. But it was the mix of the four of them working together with George Martin in the 60s that made them extraordinary. Now, moving way beyond the death of John Lennon in 1980 and the much later death of George Harrison, and then another 20 years beyond, and here we are now, looking back in this terribly nostalgic way at this work. And it's very, very difficult to produce a new song where you want to somehow represent the band in all their experimental richness and cultural richness, but in a sense you can't. It just becomes a little sort of essay in nostalgia, doesn't it? And I think it's kind of brilliant what they've done. They've made a much neater version of John's original song, which is slightly sprawling and incoherent. Paul McCartney, as always, is clearly the sort of driving force. Somehow he always was the member of the band who held everything together and, was desperate to make Abbey Road happen, and everyone else was dragging their feet. And it's still the case. In fact, two of the band are dead and Paul's still sort of goading the thing forward. So it's sort of touching to see him really work hard at realising this. And of course, Giles Martin, the son of George Martin, the original producer, was a key person in the production. And it's a very touching document. I think that's what I want to say. There are all sorts of controversies about production and about the sort of nostalgia and the fact that it doesn't feel experimental or it doesn't sound like the old Beatles tracks. Some of those criticisms are no doubt true, but it's very hard to say what they could have done better. And of course, in some sense, any piece of work that the Beatles release now cannot be viewed as the Beatles, not in the sense that the work that they did in the 60s was. It's certainly not the same. But Now and Then is the title of the song, and in a sense, that's what we're talking about. Now and then. And the song that we're listening to is some sort of reflection on history and on subsequent events since the band split up. Okay, that's the end of really all I need to say about the song itself. So things have changed. The configuration of the room's changed slightly because we've got Loki. He's come back from his walk, so he's here now, which makes everything better, doesn't it, Lokes? And I wanted to pick up on... Oh, he's plodding forward. So in a couple of minutes, I'll try some improvising to the Beatles Now and Then. But before I do that, I thought I'd pick up on something I said a minute ago, which was about the Beatles and how they had to learn their craft as they went along and how they didn't necessarily have access to formal education of any sort. And this enables us to segue into a brief discussion on behalf of our sponsor, Skillshare. Skillshare offers all sorts of exciting opportunities for people to develop skills in a whole raft of different directions. So you might, for example, be interested in knowing more about music theory, or you might want to join one of the music appreciation courses, or you might want to engage in knowing more about studio technique or orchestration or conducting. So there are all sorts of learning opportunities. Or you might want to branch out into some new creative area like watercolour painting or drawing, or you might want to know more about how to set up your own business. So there are all sorts of options out there on Skillshare to enable you to develop and obtain the skills that you haven't acquired before. So Ian, who's a creative force on this channel and a very talented animator and editor of the Music Professor channel, Ian's been exploring and learning new animation techniques using Skillshare. So I really do recommend the different things that you can access there. If you're interested, click on the link in the video description below, and the first 500 people who do that from this channel can get a whole month free trial on Skillshare. So I'd recommend having a go at that. In the meantime, a couple of things to say about Now and Then that have occurred to me while I've been doing this. One is, I don't know if any comments have come in from other people who've discussed or reviewed this song, but it does seem to me to fall into John Lennon's kind of Spanish style. Quite a few songs that the Beatles produced were slightly Spanish. I think that's the best way to describe them. The Sun King, for example, on Abbey Road is a rather unsubtle example. This, on the other hand, is whatever the Spanish idiom is. It swings back between A minor and this sort of the modal seventh, E minor first inversion, and then the third phrase moves the Phrygian drop from F to E. The Phrygian drop being Phrygian being the scale you get from E to E. And Spanish music, from a very long time ago, because of the Moorish influence going back over 1,000 years, has always had that Phrygian element in it. The other thing to say about Lennon's vocal line, I've always admired this in his songwriting, it has this conversational quality. I know that he highly prized a type of vocal production that resembles speech in some way. So the patterns of the melody are almost like speech. A famous example is Strawberry Fields, where the vocal line is almost like a person talking to you, communicating to you in a way directly and naturally, nakedly almost. So that again is detectable. How many D's do I have to say? Detectable in these slightly free rhythms and this lovely and slightly Spanish falling pattern that you get in the vocal line. So it's rather beautiful, rather almost say a kind of exquisite way of vocalizing. Okay, that's the first thing to say. But the other problem is that, of course, if you're then improvising as if in the start, it's a ludicrous activity, I should say that to start with. But if you're trying to imagine what Beethoven would have done with this, you can't really have a modal seventh. But that's okay. So there are various possibilities. Let me see if I can sort of improvise what Beethoven would have done had he written this song. The thing is, with any great artist, there are many, many character types that you associate with that person. So, for example, with Beethoven, very often people jump to the sort of default Beethoven, which is sort of rather fierce, a bit like the opening of the Pathetique Sonata, sort of slightly grumpy. So, of course, archetypal Beethovenian kind of style might be with the slow be Beethoven's initial approach, but it's more likely, if we're really thinking about this, that he'd have a more lyrical response to it. So a bit more like the Tempest Sonata. There's a possible sort of Tempest Sonata mixed with a little bit of Furlise. Or there's a possibility, let's take another piece that we've been looking at quite a lot, the Moonlight Sonata. So we can make this possibly work. The key thing with the Moonlight is the use of the Neapolitan, the flattened supertonic. So there are some possibilities there with Beethoven. An extremely difficult thing to do now is to try and render it in a sort of J.S.Bach idiom, partly because it's so contrapuntal, so linear, both hands need to be equal, and anyway the style of John Lennon is very remote from Bach. So he might have hang on. Quite primitive Bach, but still a tiny insight into Baroque style with the circle of fifths sequence and roughly equivalent left and right hands coming into John Lennon's material in a slightly surprising way. Okay, let's talk about Mozart. I mean, I think the most likely and the most banal approach in a Mozartian vein would be to employ the Alberti bass. Mozart doesn't use the Alberti bass that often, but let's imagine the beginning. here's another Mozartian possibility. I'm sort of thinking of his wonderful early Viennese sonata, which happens to be in the same broad tonality as John's song. So let's try. So there's a little possibility there. And of course, actually, I just played from the Turkish Rondo. Okay, let's try a slightly different style. Let's go to Chopin. Okay, so we're trying to do a sort of Chopin waltz. Franz Liszt. Let's try Ravel. There's something quite Ravelish about the ninth chord that John Lennon uses at the cadence. So. That ninth really is quite a Ravelian thing anyway. So there we go. There's a little cross-section of compositional responses to John Lennon's Now and Then, as if to suggest that what is happening now in Now and Then is being thrown back over history, and we can hear then reflected in composers of the past. Well, let me know what you think of my slightly desultory attempts to evoke the style of different composers in the Western canon and how they might interact with John Lennon. I realise it's a completely absurd exercise, but in a funny way, Now and Then itself, the original song, is slightly surreal, turning one's attention back in a way into history and interacting with it as if it's happening now is a curious exercise and a fascinating one. Okay, well, just one final thing. Ian has brilliantly set up a little button below, which enables you to join as a something called a YouTube membership, and you can pick up some badges and emojis that are evocative of the channel. So have a go at that if you feel like being generous. And in the meantime, thanks for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon.